The Montana Territory, 1884, stretched wild and endless, a land of dreams that never quite touched the horizon. Tucked between red-blushed hills and sagging fence lines stood Windfall Ranch, a patch of earth neither grand nor fertile, but to the Hensley sisters it was everything. Dawn broke slow, sifting through a veil of mist, painting the hills in soft grays and golds. Clara Hensley, 30, with hands tough as oak and eyes sharp as flint, knelt beside a broken fence post, her hammer striking steady against the morning's quiet. Her dark hair, braided tight, caught flecks of frost, and her coat, patched at the elbows, hung loose on her frame. She drove a nail into the splintered wood, her breath clouding in the chill. The post held, but the fence still leaned, a reminder of how little held Windfall together. Across the yard, Lila Hensley, 24, stepped from the well, a bucket sloshing in her hands. Her auburn curls spilled beneath a worn scarf, and she hummed a half-forgotten folk tune, her voice soft but defiant against the silence. She set the bucket down, splashing her boots, and glanced at Clara. "You planning to fix that whole fence before breakfast, Clara?" she called, a teasing lilt in her tone. Clara didn't look up, just struck another nail. "If I don't, the cows will be in town by noon." Lila grinned, but her eyes lingered on the sagging barn, the chipped paint on the house, the empty corral where hired hands once worked. "They got a long ride to town," she said, quieter now. Clara paused, wiping sweat from her brow despite the cold. "We'll check the herd after breakfast, and the south field needs turning." Her voice was steady, but the weight of unpaid bills pressed behind her words. Lila's smile faded. "We're running low on feed, and nails, and—" She trailed off, kicking a pebble. Clara stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "We'll make do. Always have." Lila nodded, but the air between them thickened, heavy with things unsaid. They turned toward the house, their boots crunching frost, the ranch sprawling small and stubborn under a sky that promised nothing. Inside the kitchen, night had settled, the fire in the hearth casting flickering shadows across the rough-hewn walls. A single oil lamp glowed on the table, illuminating a meager supper of cornbread and boiled potatoes. Clara sat, her hands folded, her face carved from resolve. Lila pushed her plate away, barely touched, and reached for a crumpled newspaper tucked in a drawer. She smoothed it flat, her fingers tracing a small, slanted advertisement. "Clara," she said, her voice soft but firm, "we can't keep patching forever." Clara's eyes flicked up, narrow. "We're managing." Lila shook her head, her curls catching the firelight. "Managing? We sold the wagon, the silver. We're eating potatoes again." She tapped the paper. "This could help." Clara leaned forward, squinting at the words. "Men of the West seek marriage and honest work, capable, discreet, ready to travel. Letters welcome." She snorted, pushing back in her chair. "Mail-order husbands? You've lost your mind, Lila." Lila's jaw tightened. "We need hands, Clara, strong ones, reliable ones, maybe someone who'd stay." Clara's laugh was sharp, joyless. "You think a stranger's going to ride in and save Windfall?" Lila met her gaze, unflinching. "I think we're out of rope and luck." The fire crackled, filling the silence. Clara stared at the paper, her hands clenching. "We don't need saving," she said, but her voice wavered. Lila leaned closer. "We need help. There's a difference." Clara looked away, out the window at the dark yard, the broken gate swinging loose. The weight of 3 years without their father pressed against her chest. Finally she exhaled, long and slow. "You write your letter. I'll think on it." Lila's eyes brightened, a spark of hope in the dim room. "That's all I'm asking," she said, and reached for a pen. The kitchen was quiet now, save for the scratch of Lila's pen against paper. A single candle burned low, wax dripping onto the table. Lila hunched over her letter, her handwriting graceful but hesitant, as if her heart hadn't decided whether this was brave or foolish. "Dear Sir," she wrote, "this land is rough, and we offer little but work, weather, and loyalty. If you can handle all three, perhaps we'll have something worth sharing." She paused, chewing the end of the pen, then added, "We're not looking for promises, just someone who means what they say." Across the table, Clara stood by the window, her arms crossed, staring at the empty corral. The wind howled outside, rattling the panes. She hadn't touched the paper yet, hadn't said a word since supper. Lila glanced at her. "You going to write, or just glare at the night?" Clara's shoulders stiffened, but she turned, her boots heavy on the floorboards. She sat, pulling the paper toward her, and picked up the pen without flourish. "I own a ranch," she wrote, her letter stark and unadorned. It needs work. You'll get food, a roof, and the truth. That's more than some can promise. She hesitated, then added, I won't ask more than I'd give myself. She folded the letter quickly, as if to hide it from herself. Lila watched, a small smile tugging at her lips. Not bad for a first try, she said. Clara grunted, pushing the letter across the table. Don't get your hopes up. They sealed the envelopes in silence, the wax hissing under the candle's flame. Tomorrow they'd ride to town. Tonight they sat, the weight of their choice settling like dust in the air. The road to town was a ribbon of frozen mud, cutting through hills dusted with snow. Clara and Lila rode side by side, their horses' breath steaming in the biting air. Clara's coat was buttoned tight, her face set like stone. Lila's scarf fluttered, her cheeks pink from the cold. The town appeared slowly, a scattering of wooden buildings, a saloon, a general store, the post office squat and weathered. Inside, the air smelled of ink and old wood. Mr. Hargrove, the postmaster, looked up from his ledger, his gray whiskers twitching. Morning, ladies, he said, eyeing the envelopes in Clara's hand. Clara slid them across the counter, her fingers steady. These need sending, she said. Hargrove raised an eyebrow but said nothing, stamping the envelopes with a practiced hand. Lila shifted beside her, her boots scuffing the floor. Hargrove paused, his stamp hovering. You gals sure about this? He asked, his voice low. Clara's jaw tightened, but Lila spoke first. No, she said, honest as daylight, but we're out of other options. Hargrove nodded, a rare softness in his eyes, and tucked the letters away. The sisters stepped outside, the wind sharper now. They mounted their horses without speaking, the weight of their choice heavier than the ride home. Behind them, the town faded into the hills, and Windfall Ranch waited, small and stubborn, under a sky that held no answers. The days after the letters were sent crawled slow, each one colder than the last. Snow-dusted Windfall Ranch, settling into the cracks of the barn and the hollows of the hills. Clara Hensley rose before dawn, her breath clouding as she hauled firewood from the lean-to. Her hands, chapped and raw, gripped the axe with a rhythm born of necessity. She split a log clean, the crack echoing in the still air, and stacked the pieces beside the house. Across the yard, Lila emerged from the barn, a sack of feed slung over her shoulder. Her scarf had slipped, and her auburn curls caught the first light, but her face was drawn, her usual spark dimmed. They worked in silence, mending a stall gate, checking the thinning herd, their boots sinking into the frosted earth. Every few days, one of them rode to town, a 3-hour trek through biting wind, to check the post office. Each time they returned empty-handed, the hope in their eyes a little thinner. One evening, as the fire burned low in the kitchen, Lila sat with a needle and thread, patching a coat that was more thread than cloth. Clara stirred a pot of thin soup, the smell of onions faint in the air. What if no one writes back, Clara? Lila asked, her voice small, her needle pausing. Clara kept stirring, her back to her sister. Then we keep going, like always. Lila's lips pressed tight, and she stabbed the needle through the fabric. I'm tired of always, she said. Clara turned, her eyes softening for a moment. She crossed the room and squeezed Lila's shoulder, her touch brief but firm. We've got each other, she said. That's enough for now. Lila nodded, but her hands trembled as she sewed, and the fire's warmth did little to ease the chill in her chest. Outside, the wind howled, and Windfall Ranch stood quiet, waiting for an answer it wasn't sure would come. The first snow had fallen, light but steady, when Lila rode into town alone. Her horse plodded through the slush, her scarf wrapped tight against the cold. The post office was warm, its air thick with the scent of ink and dust. Mr. Hargrove looked up from his counter, his whiskers twitching as he saw her. Got something for you, he said, reaching behind the counter. Lila's heart leapt, her fingers fumbling as she took the 2 envelopes he handed her. One bore strong, blocky handwriting, the other a softer, curving script. She clutched them to her chest, barely hearing Hargrove's farewell as she hurried outside. Back at Windfall, she found Clara in the barn, hammering a loose board into place. They've come, Lila said, holding up the letters, her voice bright with something close to relief. Clara set her hammer down, wiping her hands on her apron. She followed Lila to the porch, where they stood in the fading light, the snow falling soft around them. Lila opened the first letter, her fingers trembling. It was from Ezra Boone, his words plain and steady. I've worked ranches and built fences. I'm no stranger to hard days. If you need a hand and a man who keeps his word, I'll come." Clara nodded, her face unreadable. Lila opened the second, from Caleb Walsh, its tone lighter but earnest. "I'm not the strongest or the smartest, but I'm willing to learn. Your ranch sounds like a place worth fighting for. I'd like to try." Lila smiled, glancing at Clara. "He sounds hopeful," she said. Clara folded her arms. "Hope doesn't fix fences," she said, but her eyes lingered on the letters. They stood there, the envelopes heavy in their hands, knowing the world had just shifted beneath their feet. The train station was a small affair, just a few wooden planks and a creaking sign battered by years of wind. Clara and Lila stood side by side, their coats patched but clean, their shoulders squared against the cold. The sky was gray, the air sharp with the promise of more snow. Clara's hands were clasped tight, her face a mask of resolve, but her eyes darted to the horizon, where the train's whistle sounded faint. Lila shifted beside her, her scarf loose, her breath quick. "What if they're not what we expect?" she whispered. Clara's jaw tightened. "Then they'll learn to be," she said. The train hissed to a stop, steam curling into the air. Two men stepped down. The first was Ezra Boone, 32, broad-shouldered, moving with the quiet weight of a man who carried more than his pack. His coat was worn, his dark hair tucked under a hat, and his eyes, steady and gray, found Clara's. "Clara Hensley?" he asked, his voice low, like gravel under boots. "That's me," she said, stepping forward. "You're here to work?" "And stay if I'm wanted," he replied, his gaze unflinching. She nodded once, her lips a thin line. The second man was Caleb Walsh, 28, lighter on his feet, his boots polished but scuffed at the toes. He swept off his hat, revealing a mop of sandy hair, and grinned at Lila. "Lila Hensley?" he said, his voice warm. "You're even braver in person." Lila crossed her arms, her green eyes narrowing. "You haven't seen me with a pitchfork yet," she said. Caleb's grin widened. "I look forward to it," he said, a touch too smooth. Lila glanced at his boots. "Too clean," she said, and turned away. The sisters led the men to the wagon, the ride back to Windfall silent save for the creak of wheels and the wind's low moan. The ranch came into view, small and stubborn, and the weight of new beginnings settled over them all. The kitchen at Windfall Ranch glowed faintly under the flicker of an oil lamp, its light pooling on the worn table where 4 plates sat. A pot of potato soup steamed in the center, its scent thin but warm, joined by a basket of cornbread baked that morning. Clara Hensley stood at the stove, her apron dusted with flour, her movements precise as she ladled soup into bowls. Lila set the table, her auburn curls tucked behind her ears, her eyes darting to the two men seated across from each other. Ezra Boone sat straight, his hands folded, his gray eyes scanning the room. Not out of curiosity, but habit, like a man who knew trouble could come through any door. Caleb Walsh leaned back, his sandy hair catching the light, a faint smile playing on his lips as he watched Lila move. Clara sat last, her voice cutting the silence. "Rules are simple," she said, her tone flat but firm. "You work, you eat, you sleep. Don't ask questions I won't answer, and don't touch what isn't yours." Ezra nodded once, his face unreadable. "Understood," he said, his voice low. Caleb's smile widened, but his eyes stayed sharp. "Fair enough, Miss Clara," he said. "I'm not one for trouble." Lila snorted softly, sliding into her seat. "We'll see about that," she said, passing him the cornbread. Caleb took a piece, his fingers brushing hers, and grinned when she pulled her hand back quick. Ezra ate slowly, his spoon steady, saying nothing. Clara watched him, her own spoon untouched, her mind weighing every move. After a moment, Caleb broke the quiet with a story about a horse he'd once tried to ride in Kansas, his voice light, the tale ending with him in the dirt. Lila laughed, her first real laugh in days, but Clara's eyes stayed on Ezra, who offered only a faint nod. When the meal ended, Clara stood. "Rooms are in the barn, blankets are clean. We start at dawn." The men rose, Ezra with a quiet thank you, Caleb with a tip of his hat. As they stepped into the cold, Lila and Clara cleared the table, the clink of dishes filling the silence. "He talks a lot," Lila said, rinsing a bowl. Clara stacked plates, her face hard. "And he works too little, I'd wager." Lila smiled, shaking her head. "Give him a chance, Clara. They're here, aren't they?" Clara didn't answer, but her hands slowed, and the weight of two strangers under her roof settled heavier than the night. Morning broke sharp and cold, the sky a pale gray over Windfall Ranch, Snow clung to the hills and the air bit at exposed skin. Clara was first out, her boots crunching as she hauled a bucket of feed to the corral. Lila followed, a scarf loose around her neck, her breath clouding as she carried a coil of rope. Ezra Boone appeared from the barn, his coat buttoned tight, a hammer and nails already in hand. He headed for the west fence without a word, his stride sure, his eyes scanning the sagging posts. Clara watched him go, her hands pausing on the bucket. "He knows his way around," she said, half to herself. Lila glanced over, smirking. "Told you to give them a chance." Across the yard, Caleb Walsh stumbled out, his hat crooked, his polished boots slipping on the frost. He headed for the water trough where ice had formed overnight. He swung an axe at it, missed, and nearly fell, his curse muffled but clear. Lila laughed, crossing the yard with her rope. "Need a hand, city boy?" she called. Caleb grinned, rubbing his hands against the cold. "That obvious, huh?" he said, swinging again and cracking the ice this time. Lila leaned against the trough, her arms crossed. "Wondering if you've ever worked outdoors before," she said. Caleb's grin faltered, but he met her eyes. "I've worked," he said. "Just not like this." "Learn fast, then," Lila said, tossing him a pair of old gloves. She walked away, but her glance lingered, catching the way he set his jaw and swung the axe again. By midday, Ezra had reset 3 fence posts, his hammer strike steady, the new wood standing firm. Clara brought him a tin of water, her voice clipped. "You've done this before," she said. Ezra wiped sweat from his brow, his gray eyes steady. "Most fences don't care who built them, just that they hold," he said. She handed him another post, her nod brief but real. Meanwhile, Caleb struggled with the trough, his hands red from cold, but he kept at it, glancing at Lila as she mended a stall nearby. When the sun dipped low, the 4 gathered near the barn, their breath steaming. Clara looked at Ezra, then Caleb, her voice even. "Not a bad start," she said. Lila smirked at Caleb. "Keep up, Walsh," she said, and turned away, but her smile lingered. The day ended with windfall a little stronger, and 4 pairs of eyes watching each other, weighing what might come next. 2 weeks had passed since Ezra Boone and Caleb Walsh arrived at Windfall Ranch, and the rhythm of the place had shifted, however slightly. The west fence stood straighter, the barn smelled of fresh hay, and the herd, though small, grazed steady in the snow-dusted fields. Clara Hensley moved through the days with her usual steel, but her eyes lingered on Ezra more often, noting the way he worked without complaint, his hands sure and his silence heavy with things unsaid. That afternoon she was in the barn, sorting tools on a workbench, when a folded paper slipped from Ezra's saddlebag, landing soft on the straw-covered floor. It was worn, stained with sweat, the edges frayed like it had been carried too long. Clara hesitated, her fingers hovering, but something sharp in her chest urged her to pick it up. She unfolded it, her breath catching at the words stamped in black ink: dishonorable discharge, charges, insubordination, desertion in time of command. Her hands didn't shake, but her jaw tightened, the air in the barn suddenly too thin. That evening, by the hearth's flickering light, she faced Ezra, the paper held between them like a blade. "You served," she said, her voice low, each word deliberate, "and you left." Ezra stood near the door, his coat still on, his gray eyes meeting hers without flinching. "I left the war, not the men," he said, his voice steady but rough. "I was ordered to do things that broke what was left of me." Clara's grip on the paper tightened, the edges crumpling. "And now you're here, asking to stay, with this in your bag?" Ezra stepped closer, his hands open at his sides. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I just want to build something right for once." The fire snapped, filling the silence. Clara's chest ached with the weight of trust she'd never given easily. She handed the paper back, her eyes hard. "Fix the north fence by morning," she said. "Then we'll see where you stand." Ezra took the paper, his fingers brushing hers, and nodded once. He stepped into the cold without another word, leaving Clara alone with the fire and the questions she couldn't yet answer. The next evening, supper was quieter than usual, the clink of spoons against bowls the only sound in the kitchen. Lila Hensley passed the cornbread, her green eyes flicking between Clara's taut silence and Ezra's steady calm. Caleb Walsh, sensing the tension, kept his usual chatter to a minimum, though his foot tapped restlessly under the table. As Lila cleared the plates, she handed Caleb a letter, its envelope creased from the ride to town. "This came for you," she said, her voice even but her gaze sharp. Caleb's fingers paused on the letter, his sandy hair falling into his eyes. He opened it, scanning the familiar handwriting, and his shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. "From my sister," he said finally, his voice softer than usual. Lila sat across from him, her arms crossed. "She's got 2 kids, husband gone, winter coming hard. She wants me home." Lila's lips pressed tight, but her voice stayed steady. "And you?" Caleb folded the letter, his fingers lingering on the edges. "I told her I'd think on it," he said. Lila leaned forward, her eyes locking on his. "You already thought on it, didn't you?" Caleb looked up, his usual grin gone, replaced by something raw. "I came here to start something new, Lila, but she needs me. She always has." Lila's voice softened, but there was steel beneath it. "And I don't?" Caleb's gaze held hers. No charm left, just truth. "You do," he said. "But I don't know if I can be 2 things at once." Lila stood, stacking plates with a clatter. "Then figure it out," she said, and turned to the sink. Clara watched from the corner, her own silence heavy with the weight of secrets now shared. Ezra ate slowly, his eyes on his bowl, but his presence felt like an anchor in the room. The meal ended, and the 4 parted ways, the air between them thicker than the snow piling outside. Morning brought a new kind of trouble to Windfall Ranch. Clara was checking the herd in the west pasture, her breath steaming in the cold, when she noticed a gap in the fence, its posts snapped clean, the wire twisted and torn. She knelt, her gloved fingers tracing hoofprints in the snow, not their cattle but horses, ridden hard. 2 cows were missing, their tracks leading into the hills. Her stomach twisted, the math of loss running sharp in her mind. She rode back to the ranch, her face set like stone, and found Lila, Ezra, and Caleb in the barn, mending harnesses. "We've got trouble," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Someone's stealing cattle." Lila's hands stilled on the leather, her green eyes wide. Ezra set his knife down, his gray gaze steady. "Rustlers," he said, not a question. Clara nodded. "They hit the west pasture. Took 2 head, maybe more if we don't move fast." Caleb looked up, his sandy hair damp with sweat. "How do we stop them?" he asked, his voice earnest but uncertain. Clara's eyes flicked to Ezra, who stood, his hands already reaching for his coat. "I've dealt with their kind before," he said. "In the army we patrolled for worse. We'll watch the fields at night." Clara's jaw tightened, the memory of his discharge paper flashing in her mind, but she nodded. Caleb stood, his boots scuffing the floor. "I'm in," he said, glancing at Lila. "I'm not much with a gun, but I'll learn." Lila handed him a rifle from the wall, her expression unreadable. "Don't shoot your foot off," she said, but her hand lingered on his arm a moment longer. Clara looked at the 3 of them, her voice hard. "We can't afford to lose more. If we're doing this, we do it right." Ezra met her gaze, his nod brief but firm. The barn fell silent, the weight of the fight ahead settling over them like the snow that buried the hills. The afternoon sun hung low over Windfall Ranch, its light pale and fleeting through a sky heavy with clouds. Snow crunched underfoot as Clara Hensley led Ezra Boone, Caleb Walsh, and Lila Hensley into the barn, where the air smelled of leather and hay. A single lantern swung from a beam, casting shadows across the tools and harnesses stacked against the walls. Clara spread a rough map of the ranch on a workbench, her gloved finger tracing the west pasture where the rustlers had struck. "They'll come back tonight," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "They know we're short-handed." Ezra leaned over the map, his gray eyes scanning the lines of hills and fences. His coat was buttoned tight, but his hands moved with the calm of a man who'd seen worse than thieves. "We'll set up here," he said, pointing to a ridge overlooking the pasture. "High ground, good cover. I'll show Caleb the basics." Caleb, standing by the door, shifted his weight, the rifle in his hands looking heavier than he'd expected. "I'm no soldier," he said, his sandy hair falling into his eyes, "but I'll do what you need." Ezra nodded, his face unreadable. "Keep your eyes open and your hands steady." "That's enough for now." Lila, sorting bullets from a tin box, glanced at Caleb, her green eyes sharp but softer than before. She handed him a handful of rounds, her fingers lingering a moment. "Don't go shooting the moon," she said, her voice half teasing, half serious. Caleb grinned, pocketing the bullets. "Only if it's stealing cows," he said. Clara watched them all, her jaw tight, the memory of Ezra's discharge paper still sharp in her mind. She handed Ezra a second rifle, her eyes locking on his. "You sure about this?" she asked, low enough that only he heard. "I'm here," he said, his voice like gravel. "That's all you need to know." Outside, Lila and Clara prepared a sack of dried meat and bread for the night, their hands moving quick in the fading light. As Ezra and Caleb checked their gear, the barn felt smaller, the air thick with the weight of what lay ahead. They stepped into the cold, the ridge waiting, and Windfall Ranch held its breath. Night fell hard over the west pasture, the moon a thin sliver behind clouds, casting the hills in shades of gray and black. Ezra Boone crouched behind a cluster of scrub pines on the ridge, his rifle resting easy in his hands, his gray eyes scanning the darkness. Caleb Walsh knelt beside him, his breath quick and shallow, the rifle unfamiliar but gripped tight. Snow dusted their coats, and the cold bit through their gloves, but Ezra's voice was steady when he spoke. "Watch the fence line," he said, low and calm. "They'll come from the north, where the trees are thick." Caleb nodded, his sandy hair tucked under his hat, his eyes straining against the shadows. "You done this a lot?" he whispered. Ezra's jaw tightened, but he answered, "Enough to know it's never clean." Below, the pasture was still, the remaining cattle huddled against the wind. Then a faint sound, hooves, muffled, but deliberate. Ezra raised a hand, signaling Caleb to stay low. 4 figures emerged from the trees, their horses moving slow, their shapes blurred by the dark. "Rustlers," Ezra muttered, his finger on the trigger. He aimed high, firing a single shot into the air, the crack splitting the night. The horses reared, and the men cursed, their voices sharp with surprise. Caleb, heart pounding, followed Ezra's lead, firing a warning shot that echoed off the hills. The rustlers hesitated, then turned, spurring their horses back into the trees. Ezra stood, his rifle still raised, tracking their retreat. "They're gone," he said, but his voice held no relief. Caleb exhaled, his hands shaking but his grin wide. "We did it," he said, half laughing. Ezra clapped his shoulder, a rare gesture. "You didn't run," he said, "that's something." They descended the ridge, their boots sinking into the snow, and rode back to Windfall. The night now quiet but heavy with what they'd faced. The cattle were safe, but the cost was written in the bruises on their hands and the questions in their eyes. Dawn broke over Windfall Ranch, the sky a pale wash of pink and gray, the snow glinting soft in the early light. Clara Hensley stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of oats, her face drawn but her hands steady. Lila was at the table, bandaging a scrape on Caleb Walsh's knuckles, her touch gentle, but her green eyes searching his face. Ezra Boone sat across from them, his coat draped over the chair, his gray eyes fixed on the coffee in his hands. The air was warm with the scent of oats and wood smoke, but the weight of the night lingered. Clara set bowls on the table, her voice breaking the silence. "You kept the herd," she said, her tone even but her eyes softer than usual. "That's more than I expected." Ezra looked up, his nod brief. "They won't be back soon," he said, "not after last night." Caleb flexed his bandaged hand, grinning despite the ache. "Felt good to do something right," he said, glancing at Lila. She rolled her eyes but smiled, tying off the bandage. "Don't get cocky, Walsh," she said. Clara sat, her bowl untouched, and looked at Ezra. "You led them well," she said, the words careful, like she was testing their fit. "You've done more than mend fences." Ezra's fingers tightened on his mug, but his voice was steady. "I told you I'm here," he said. "That hasn't changed." Lila leaned back, her voice lighter but firm. "And you, Caleb? Still thinking about running home?" Caleb's grin faded, his eyes meeting hers. "I wrote my sister yesterday," he said. "Told her I'm staying. I'll send what I can, but this is where I'm needed." Lila's smile was small but real, and she pushed a bowl toward him. "Eat then," she said. "You'll need it." Clara watched them all, her chest loosening for the first time in weeks. The night had tested them, and they'd held. She spooned her oats, the silence now warmer, the ranch a little stronger. Outside, the snow fell soft, and Windfall stood firm, its heart beating in the 4 who called it home. Winter tightened its grip on Windfall Ranch, the snow piling thick against the barn and frosting the hills in shimmering white. Yet the days felt warmer, the air lighter, as if the night on the ridge had forged something new among the 4 who called the ranch home. Clara Hensley walked the east field with Ezra Boone, their boots sinking into the snow as they checked the cattle, their shoulders brushing now and then. The cold bit at Clara's cheeks, but her dark braids swung loose, and her eyes, once sharp with doubt, softened when they met Ezra's. They paused by a frozen stream, the ice glinting under the midday sun. "You ever talk about why you left the army?" Clara asked, her voice low, her breath clouding. Ezra's gray eyes traced the stream, his hands tucked into his coat. "Not much to say," he said. Orders came to burn a village. Women, kids, I couldn't do it. Walked away instead. Clara nodded, her fingers tightening on her scarf. Her own past rose unbidden. The years after her father's death, the weight of windfall on her shoulders. Lost my pot of fever, she said, the words slow. Been holding this place together since. Ezra looked at her, his face open for the first time. You're stronger than most, Clara, he said. I want to belong here, with you. Clara's chest tightened, but she met his gaze, her nod small but real. Keep working, Boone, she said, a faint smile breaking through. We'll see. Across the ranch, Lila Hensley and Caleb Walsh mucked out the stalls, their laughter echoing in the barn. Caleb's sandy hair was damp with sweat, his sleeves rolled up despite the cold. He leaned on his pitchfork, grinning as Lila tossed a handful of straw at him. You're slowing down, Walsh, she teased, her green eyes bright. Caleb caught her wrist, his touch light but warm. I'm staying, Lila, he said, his voice suddenly serious. Not just for the ranch, for you. Lila's smile faded, her heart quickening. You sure about that? She asked, half challenging. Caleb stepped closer, his grin returning but softer. Never been surer, he said. She pulled her wrist free, but her laugh was warm, and she handed him the pitchfork. Prove it then, she said, and turned back to work, her glance lingering. The ranch hummed with quiet promises, each day weaving Clara and Ezra, Lila and Caleb closer, their steps surer on the land they fought for. The promise of spring was still distant, but Windfall Ranch buzzed with a different kind of hope as the community gathered for a double wedding. The barn, swept clean of hay, stood transformed, its rafters strung with oil lanterns that cast a golden glow. Neighbors arrived on horseback and in creaking wagons, their arms laden with planks for tables, quilts to drape the walls, and baskets of bread, pies, and smoked meats. Clara Hensley stood in the house, smoothing the simple cotton dress she'd sewn, a sprig of dried lavender pinned to the collar. Her dark braid was neat, but her hands trembled as Lila adjusted the hem. You look beautiful, Clara, Lila said, her own dress a soft gray, her auburn curls pinned with a ribbon. Clara's lips twitched, almost a smile. Don't get used to this, she said. Lila laughed, her green eyes bright with nerves and joy. Outside, Ezra Boone and Caleb Walsh helped the men haul benches into the barn, their coats shed in the flurry of work. Ezra's shirt was rolled to his elbows, his gray eyes calm but warm as he caught Clara's silhouette through the window. Caleb, his sandy hair mussed, joked with a neighbor about his polished boots, now scuffed from ranch work. Mr. Hargrove, the postmaster, clapped Caleb's shoulder, his whiskers twitching. You clean up nice, son, he said. Caleb grinned. Took some doing, sir, he said, glancing at Lila as she carried a basket of apples inside. Women bustled in the kitchen, their voices mingling with the clatter of pots, while children ran underfoot, dodging the legs of tables. The circuit preacher, Elias, arrived last. His tall frame stooped from years on the trail, his Bible tucked in a worn satchel. He greeted Clara and Lila with a kind smile, his eyes crinkling. Ready for this, ladies? He asked. Lila nodded, her laugh nervous. Clara's voice was steady. As I'll ever be, she said. The barn filled with the scent of pine boughs and cinnamon, the air alive with anticipation. As dusk fell, the lanterns flickered, and Windfall Ranch stood ready, its heart open to the vows that would bind it anew. The barn glowed under the lantern light, its rough walls softened by quilts and pine boughs tied with cotton ribbons. Neighbors crowded inside, their coats and shawls bundled against the cold, their faces warm with smiles and fog breath. A makeshift aisle ran down the center, flanked by benches and scattered with straw. At the front, by a stall gate draped with greenery, Elias stood, his Bible open, his voice steady and kind. Clara Hensley walked first, her cotton dress swaying, the lavender sprig catching the light. Her steps were slow, deliberate, her dark eyes fixed on Ezra Boone, who waited at the front, his shirt pressed, his gray eyes soft but steady. The crowd hushed, their whispers fading as Clara reached him. Elias spoke, his words simple. Clara, do you take this man to walk beside you through hard seasons and good? Clara's voice was clear, unwavering. I do, she said, her hand finding Ezra's, his calluses warm against hers. Elias turned to Ezra. Ezra, do you take this woman to stand with you, come storm or sun? Ezra's voice was low, reverent. I do, he said, squeezing her hand. Elias nodded, and Ezra leaned down, his lips brushing Clara's in a slow, gentle kiss, his forehead resting against hers for a moment before they stepped back, the crowd clapping soft. Then Lila Hensley appeared, her gray dress glowing in the lantern light, her auburn curls bouncing as she walked, her smile bright through her nerves. Caleb Walsh met her halfway, his sandy hair neat, his grin wide and unguarded. The crowd chuckled as Lila paused, her voice teasing. "Don't outdance me, Walsh," she said, loud enough for all to hear. Elias smiled. "Lila, do you take this man come dust or snow? Only if he keeps up," Lila said, her laugh sparking laughter around her. "Caleb, do you take this woman come sunrise or storm?" Caleb's eyes locked on hers, his voice sure. "With everything I have," he said. Their kiss was quick, joyful, and Caleb dipped her slightly, drawing a cheer from the crowd. The barn erupted in applause, the air thick with warmth, and Windfall Ranch felt, for the first time in years, like a home made whole. The barn at Windfall Ranch pulsed with life, its lantern light spilling across tables, groaning under the weight of roasted venison, apple pies, and jugs of cider. Fiddle music sparked from a corner, the notes quick and bright, urging boots to thump against the makeshift dance floor of old floorboards. Neighbors swirled in pairs, their laughter mingling with the clink of tin cups and the shouts of children dodging through the crowd. Clara Hensley stood near the barn door, her cotton dress still pinned with lavender, her dark braid loose from the day's warmth. Ezra Boone was at her side, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his gray eyes softer than she'd ever seen. They watched the dancers, their shoulders closed but not touching, the air between them charged with something new. "You dance, Boone?" Clara asked, her voice low, a rare tease in her tone. Ezra's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Not much," he said, "but I'd try for you." She glanced at him, her heart quickening, and took his hand, leading him to the floor. Their steps were slow, cautious, but steady, their hands finding a rhythm that felt like home. Across the barn, Lila Hensley spun with Caleb Walsh, her gray dress flaring, her auburn curls bouncing as she laughed. Caleb's sandy hair was mussed, his grin wide as he tried to keep up, his boots slipping once but catching her waist. "You're not half bad, Walsh," Lila said, her green eyes bright. Caleb pulled her closer, his voice warm. "Give me time, I'll be better," he said, and dipped her low, drawing a cheer from the crowd. Mr. Hargrove, the postmaster, raised a cup of cider, his whiskers twitching as he toasted the couples. "To Windfall," he called. "And to love that stays," the barn roared, and the music played on. As the night deepened, Clara and Ezra slipped outside, standing on the porch under a sky dusted with stars. "You ever feel like you belong somewhere?" Ezra asked, his voice quiet. Clara looked at the ranch, its silhouette strong against the snow. "Not often," she said, "but tonight I do." They stood shoulder to shoulder, the music faint behind them, and Windfall felt like a promise kept. Morning broke gentle over Windfall Ranch, the snow sparkling under a sky flushed pink and gold. The air was crisp, the hills quiet, but the ranch hummed with the memory of the night before. Clara Hensley walked the north fence, her boots crunching frost, her coat open to the warming day. Ezra Boone walked beside her, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his gray eyes scanning the horizon not for trouble but for the future. The fence stood firm, its new posts a testament to their work, and Clara's hand brushed Ezra's as they paused by the gate. "We've got a long season ahead," she said, her voice steady but warm. Ezra nodded, his hand closing over hers. "We'll make it, Clara," he said. Together, she met his gaze, her smile small but unguarded, and they turned back to the ranch. Their steps matched. In the corral, Lila Hensley tossed feed to the cattle, her scarf loose, her laughter ringing as Caleb Walsh tried to herd a stubborn calf. His sandy hair caught the light, his sleeves rolled up, his grin wide despite the calf's protests. "You're hopeless, Walsh," Lila called, but her green eyes danced. Caleb jogged to her side, brushing straw from his hands. "Not hopeless," he said, "just learning. And I've got the best teacher." Lila handed him the feed bucket, her laugh soft. "Keep at it then," she said, but she stood closer, their shoulders touching as they worked. The four gathered later by the barn, their breath steaming in the cool air, their faces lit with a quiet strength. Windfall Ranch stretched before them, its fields blanketed in snow, its heart beating in the hands that held it. Clara looked at Ezra, then Lila and Caleb, her voice firm but full. "We did this," she said, "and we'll keep doing it." Lila nodded, her arm looping through Caleb's. "For as long as it takes," she said. Ezra's hand rested on Clara's shoulder, his voice low. "For good," he said. They stood together, the horizon wide and open, and Windfall Ranch, small but unyielding, shone under the new day's light.